Inside San Quentin Death Row, the longest wait. Just across the water from one of the wealthiest regions in the United States sits a prison that has become one of the most debated institutions in American criminal justice. San Quentin State Prison has operated since 1852, making it the oldest prison in California. Over nearly 2 centuries, it has housed some of the most infamous criminals in the state's history. But one section of the prison became particularly controversial. A narrow corridor of cells. A place where hundreds of condemned prisoners waited. Sometimes for decades. This was California's death row. And for many of the men sent here, the wait for execution became longer than anyone in the American justice system had anticipated. Some inmates spent 20, 30, even more than 40 years awaiting a sentence that never arrived. Executions were scheduled. Appeals were filed. Court rulings intervened. And year after year, the wait continued. By the early 2000s, the death row at San Quentin had grown into the largest death row population in the United States. Yet executions had nearly stopped. So what exactly happened inside San Quentin's death row? Why did hundreds of inmates spend decades waiting for an execution that rarely came? And what was daily life actually like for the men living inside those cells? Tonight, we take a factual, documented look inside San Quentin death row, and the longest wait in American capital punishment. Before we continue, if you value fact-based crime and prison documentaries, consider supporting the channel The Inmate Diaries. Your support through liking this video and subscribing to the channel helps us continue producing carefully researched stories based on real records, real cases, and documented history. Now, let's step inside one of the most debated death row systems in the United States. The prison on the Bay. To understand San Quentin's death row, it helps to start with the prison itself. San Quentin State Prison was established in 1852, during the early years of California's statehood. The prison was built on a peninsula along the San Francisco Bay, north of the city of San Francisco. Its location served several purposes. The surrounding water made escape extremely difficult. The remote area, at the time, kept dangerous prisoners away from growing population centers. And the prison's position along the bay allowed supplies to arrive by boat. In the 19th century, San Quentin quickly became the primary state prison for California. Over time, thousands of inmates passed through its gates. Many were serving long sentences. Some were awaiting trial. And eventually, a small number were sentenced to death. Executions in California originally took place using hanging. But in 1893, the state introduced a new execution method: the gas chamber. And San Quentin became the central location for carrying out those executions. For decades, inmates sentenced to death across California were transported here to await their final sentence. Executions continued regularly throughout the early and mid-20th century. But the system that would eventually create the longest waits on death row did not exist yet. At the time, executions usually happened within a few years of sentencing. Appeals existed, but they were far more limited than they would become later. That began to change in the late 20th century. And those changes would transform San Quentin into something very different from what it had once been. A place where prisoners no longer waited months or years, but decades. The creation of California's modern death row. The modern era of California's death row began after a major shift in American law. In 1972, the United States Supreme Court issued a landmark ruling in the case of Furman versus Georgia. The court ruled that existing death penalty laws across the country were unconstitutional. As a result, executions across the United States, including California, were temporarily halted. Hundreds of inmates who had been sentenced to death saw their sentences overturned or commuted. But the pause did not last forever. In 1976, the Supreme Court allowed capital punishment to resume under revised laws in the case of Gregg versus Georgia. States were permitted to reinstate the death penalty if their sentencing procedures met certain constitutional requirements. California responded by rewriting its death penalty laws. In 1978, voters approved a ballot initiative known as Proposition 7. The measure expanded the list of crimes that could qualify for the death penalty. And it significantly increased the number of defendants eligible to receive that sentence. The impact was immediate. More prosecutors began seeking death sentences. More juries began issuing them. And more inmates began arriving at San Quentin. But something else was also happening. The legal process surrounding death penalty cases had grown far more complex. New layers of appeals. Additional court reviews. Federal oversight. And decades of legal arguments. All of these factors would gradually slow the execution process. By the 1980s and 1990s, the number of condemned inmates was growing steadily. But executions were becoming less frequent. San Quentin's death row population was expanding. And the wait for execution was beginning to stretch longer and longer. The death row cell block. Inside San Quentin, most condemned prisoners were housed in a building known as East Block. Constructed in 1927, East Block is one of the most recognizable structures inside the prison. The building rises 5 tiers high, with narrow metal walkways connecting rows of cells. Each tier overlooks the central corridor below. The design resembles an early 20th century prison style often called a cell block stack. The cells themselves are small. Approximately 4.5 feet wide and about 9 feet deep, according to prison records. Inside each cell, a metal bed frame, a sink and toilet combination, a small desk surface, and limited personal storage. For inmates on death row, these cells became the center of daily life. Unlike many prisoners in the general population, condemned inmates typically spent most of their time alone in their cells. Movement was tightly controlled. Meals were delivered through small slots in the doors. Exercise usually took place in individual recreation cages, sometimes referred to as dog runs. These outdoor spaces were narrow, fenced enclosures designed to prevent contact between inmates. Security was strict. The prison administration considered death row inmates to be among the highest security risks in the system. Some had committed multiple murders. Others had been convicted of particularly violent crimes. And a small number had histories of violence while incarcerated. But over time, another factor began to define San Quentin's death row. Not the crimes. Not the executions. But the waiting. By the early 2000s, hundreds of men were living inside these cells. Many had already been there for more than a decade. And some would remain there for far longer. The growing death row. The fastest growing death row in America. By the early 1980s, California's death penalty system had entered a new phase. Following the reinstatement of capital punishment after Gregg versus Georgia, prosecutors across the state began pursuing death sentences more frequently. California's revised death penalty law, approved by voters through Proposition 7 in 1978, greatly expanded the number of crimes eligible for capital punishment. Under the new law, prosecutors could seek the death penalty in cases involving multiple victims, murder during certain felonies such as robbery or kidnapping, and several other aggravated circumstances. The result was a dramatic increase in death sentences. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, California juries issued dozens of death sentences each year. Every one of those inmates was transferred to the same place. San Quentin State Prison. The prison quickly became the central holding location for nearly every condemned inmate in the state. And the numbers continued to climb. By the early 1990s, San Quentin's death row had become the largest death row population in the United States. New inmates arrived faster than the system could process their appeals. Cells that had once been sparsely occupied were now filled. Additional sections of the prison were converted to hold condemned prisoners. By 2000, California had more than 600 inmates on death row, the largest condemned population in the country. Yet something unusual was happening. Even as the number of inmates grew, executions remained extremely rare. Many prisoners sentenced in the 1980s were still awaiting execution well into the 1990s. And inmates sentenced in the 1990s would still be waiting in the 2000s. The reason for these delays was not a single law or decision. Instead, it was the result of a legal process that had become one of the most complex in the American justice system. The long appeals process. When a defendant in California receives a death sentence, the legal process does not end. In fact, it has only just begun. Under California law, every death penalty case automatically receives multiple layers of appeal. The first stage is known as the direct appeal. This review is conducted by the state's highest court, the Supreme Court of California. During this phase, the court examines the trial record to determine whether legal errors occurred. These appeals are often extremely lengthy. A typical capital trial record can contain tens of thousands of pages of testimony, evidence, and legal arguments. The justices must review the entire record before issuing a decision. And because California assigns every death penalty appeal directly to its highest court, the system can become congested. But the process does not stop there. If the death sentence is upheld, inmates may file state habeas corpus petitions, raising additional claims such as ineffective assistance of counsel or newly discovered evidence. After the state process concludes, prisoners can then pursue federal appeals in the United States court system. These cases can move through several levels of federal courts, sometimes reaching the Supreme Court of the United States. Each step requires extensive legal review. Each stage can take years. And in some cases, new legal issues arise during the process, sending the case back to lower courts for additional hearings. As a result, the timeline between sentencing and execution has expanded dramatically. By the early 2000s, the average wait on California's death row exceeded 15 years. For many inmates, the wait would become even longer. A death row that kept growing. Throughout the 1990s, San Quentin's death row continued to expand. Each year, dozens of inmates were sentenced to death in California courts. But only a small number were executed. Between 1978 and the early 2000s, California issued hundreds of death sentences. Yet executions occurred only occasionally. According to official state records, California carried out 13 executions between 1992 and 2006. Compared to the hundreds of inmates on death row, the number was extremely small. This imbalance created a growing backlog. By 2005, San Quentin held more than 640 condemned prisoners. Most were housed inside East Block. Some were held in adjacent high-security units. The prison had become the largest death row in the United States. And as the population increased, the average waiting time grew longer. Some inmates died of natural causes while their appeals were still pending. Others committed suicide. A number of prisoners remained on death row for more than 30 years. Legal experts began referring to California's system as a death row phenomenon, a situation in which inmates spend decades awaiting execution without a final resolution. For critics of the death penalty, this raised serious questions about whether the system was functioning as intended. For supporters, the long appeals process was necessary to prevent wrongful executions. And inside San Quentin, the condemned inmates continued waiting. Year after year. Daily life on San Quentin death row. While the legal system moved slowly outside the prison walls, daily life inside San Quentin followed a strict routine. Condemned inmates were typically confined to their cells for more than 20 hours per day. Each morning began with a security count, during which officers verified the presence of every inmate. Meals were delivered through slots in the cell doors. The food generally matched the standard prison menu served throughout the facility. Several days each week, inmates were allowed individual recreation periods. These sessions took place inside fenced exercise cages located on the prison yard. Each cage allowed a prisoner to walk, stretch, or exercise alone. Direct contact between inmates was restricted. Communication often occurred by shouting between cells or passing notes through the bars during brief opportunities. Despite these restrictions, many inmates spent their time reading, writing, studying, or communicating with attorneys and family members. Some participated in educational correspondence programs. Others created artwork or wrote letters that later appeared in books and news reports. Religious services were occasionally provided by prison chaplains. Medical and mental health care were also available within the prison system. But the most defining feature of death row life was uncertainty. For some inmates, appeals progressed slowly through the courts. For others, legal proceedings stalled for years. And for a small number, execution dates were eventually scheduled. But even those dates were not always final. Because in California, execution itself had become increasingly rare. Executions, legal battles, and the end of San Quentin's death row. When executions did happen. Despite the growing population on death row, executions at San Quentin did occur, though far less frequently than the number of death sentences suggested. For most of California's history, executions were carried out inside the prison's gas chamber. The method involved releasing lethal hydrogen cyanide gas into a sealed chamber where the condemned prisoner was strapped to a chair. The practice was used for decades throughout the 20th century. But in the 1990s, the execution method became the subject of intense legal scrutiny. In 1996, a federal court ruled that California's use of the gas chamber constituted cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment. The decision came in the case of Fierro v. Gomez. As a result of the ruling, California shifted its primary execution method to lethal injection. San Quentin built a new execution chamber inside the prison. From 1992 to 2006, California carried out 13 executions at San Quentin. Among those executed were several inmates whose crimes had received widespread public attention. One of the most widely known cases involved Stanley Tookie Williams. Williams had been convicted of multiple murders committed in 1979. He was also known as one of the founders of the Crip Street Gang. While incarcerated, Williams later wrote children's books and publicly spoke out against gang violence. Supporters argued that his efforts to discourage gang activity should spare him from execution. Opponents maintained that the crimes for which he had been convicted were extremely serious. After years of appeals, Williams was executed at San Quentin in December 2005 by lethal injection. His case became one of the most internationally discussed executions in California's history. But executions like this were becoming increasingly rare. Because another legal battle was already underway, one that would soon stop them altogether. The lethal injection controversy. By the early 2000s, a new legal controversy began surrounding California's execution procedures. The issue was not whether the state had the authority to carry out executions. Instead, it focused on how the executions were conducted. California's lethal injection protocol used a three-drug combination. The first drug was intended to render the inmate unconscious. The second caused paralysis. And the third stopped the heart. Critics argued that if the first drug failed to fully anesthetize the prisoner, the inmate could experience extreme pain while being unable to move or speak. In 2006, a federal judge reviewed California's lethal injection procedures in the case of Morales v. Tilton. The court found that the system had serious procedural problems. According to the ruling, the execution process risked violating the Eighth Amendment prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. Among the concerns cited were inadequate staff training, unclear medical oversight, improper preparation of execution drugs. Because of these findings, the court halted executions until the state could revise its procedures. California began attempting to rewrite its execution protocols. But the process became mired in additional legal challenges. Years passed without a single execution. Meanwhile, San Quentin's death row population continued to grow. The longest wait. By the 2010s, California's death row had reached an unprecedented situation. Hundreds of inmates were still awaiting execution. But the state had not carried out an execution since 2006. Many prisoners had already spent 2 or 3 decades on death row. Some had been sentenced in the 1970s and 1980s. In several cases, inmates died of natural causes before their appeals were completed. Others remained in legal limbo, their cases moving slowly through courts. The average time between sentencing and execution in California had grown to more than 20 years. For some inmates, the wait extended beyond 30 years. Legal scholars and policymakers began debating whether the system had become unworkable. Supporters of the death penalty argued that repeated legal challenges had created unnecessary delays. Opponents argued that the lengthy appeals process was essential to prevent wrongful executions. Several studies pointed out another reality. Because the appeals process took so long, many condemned inmates would likely die in prison before their executions could occur. This situation raised a question that California voters and lawmakers would eventually have to confront. If executions were no longer taking place, what was the future of death row itself? The transformation of San Quentin. In 2019, California Governor Gavin Newsom issued an executive order placing a moratorium on executions in the state. The order suspended the use of the death chamber at San Quentin. It also halted the development of new lethal injection protocols. The decision did not eliminate the death penalty itself, but it effectively stopped executions during the governor's administration. At the time, California had more than 700 inmates on death row, the largest population of condemned prisoners anywhere in the Western world. Then, in 2020, another major change occurred. California announced that condemned inmates would gradually be moved out of San Quentin's traditional death row housing. Instead of being kept permanently in the isolated East Block cells, inmates could be transferred to other prisons based on their security classification and behavior. Officials stated that the goal was to integrate inmates into the broader prison system while still maintaining their death sentences. Over time, many of the cells that had once held condemned prisoners were emptied. For decades, those cells had symbolized the final step in California's criminal justice system. Now, they represented something different. A system that had changed dramatically. The end of an era. For generations, San Quentin stood at the center of California's death penalty system. It was the place where condemned inmates waited, and where executions were carried out. But over time, the system surrounding it changed. Legal safeguards expanded. Appeals grew more complex. Public debate intensified. And executions became increasingly rare. The result was a prison unit where inmates often spent decades waiting for a sentence that might never be carried out. For some prisoners, that wait became the defining feature of their lives behind bars. Today, San Quentin remains one of the most historically significant prisons in the United States. But the death row that once filled its towering cell blocks is no longer what it used to be. And the future of capital punishment in California remains uncertain. What is clear, however, is that the story of San Quentin's death row reveals something deeper about the American justice system. A system constantly evolving. And constantly debating where justice should begin, and where it should end. Thank you for watching the Inmate Diaries. If you found this documentary informative, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us continue producing fact-based crime and prison documentaries built on real records and documented history. And if you want to explore more stories from inside the world's most controversial prisons, stay tuned. Because there are many more stories still waiting to be told.